In this week's episode of Learning to Cook on a Budget with yours truly, we are doing biscuits. I'm going to show you how to do drop biscuits as well as cut biscuits, and we are going to make the perfect butter compound to go with these biscuits. A butter compound is where you let a stick or half a stick of butter soften, and then you mix in different ingredients, savory or sweet, and then you roll it up in parchment paper or plastic wrap and then put it back into the fridge, let it harden, and then you have essentially a flavored butter. And for today's biscuits, we are going to be making a maple cardamom. If you don't have cardamom, maple cinnamon would also work just as well. So we are going to make that now. I have a stick of butter that I have already softened, and I'm just going to put it into a small bowl. Making the butter compound you do need to do in advance. So I would suggest, the night before you're going to bake. And this is already nice and softened. So we set this out a couple hours, let it soften on the counter, and then we're going to mix in these other ingredients, roll it up, and then it'll take a couple hours to then harden in the fridge. So make ahead, which is why we're kicking off this video with this. So I'm going to measure in 2 tablespoons of maple syrup. And this will combine together, even though we have the oily butter with the watery maple syrup. I promise it will combine. I am going to use my trusty mini spinella. These are new. Maybe you've seen them already in the store. I like using a small little spatula or mini spinella. I do have the mini spatulas as well. They just incorporate really nicely, and you're just gonna give it a little spin, little fold until all of that incorporates the maple into the butter. Use the back of the spinella, works really well to kind of smooth out some of that butter. It's already really soft, but I'm gonna get that to smooth out. All right, now that we have the butter and maple combined, again, I'm the marketing person now for cardamom, a couple of dashes. Cinnamon, you could go maybe a little heavier. It's not quite as potent of a flavor as cardamom is. So you could do a half a teaspoon of cinnamon, but I would do just a couple of dashes of that cardamom. And just mix that until it's well combined. The cinnamon's easy to see, the cardamom's easy to see. I think those two would probably be my preferred. They just go well with the biscuits. Now that the butter is nice and compounded, we are going to scrape onto parchment or plastic wrap. I just happen to have these already sort of pre-cut parchment slices, which is actually perfect. It needs to be large enough to completely seal up this so that we can put it back into the fridge to harden. And we want to shape it back into sort of the stick of butter or the kind of that log shape so that it's easy to slice the butter off. So I'm just going to kind of push down and just use the parchment paper. I shouldn't even get any on my hands, to kind of reform it into that stick shape. Roll, log, stick, whatever you like. And then we're just going to continue. I usually try and press out. You can see there's a little air bubble there. Try and press out that air bubble so it gets to that nice cylindrical shape. Kind of give it a pull and a tug, roll it up, and then we're going to push over both sides and then put this into the fridge. And then we have our hardened version of compound butter. I'm just gonna keep it, store it in here. You could store it into a plastic bag. That's what it'll look like once it's hardened. So I'm gonna put both of these back in the fridge, and then they will be ready to go once our biscuits are baked. Now that we have the maple butter compound made and into the fridge, we are going to get started on the drop biscuits first. I'm also going to teach you how to do a buttermilk cut biscuit. The recipes are very similar. There are a couple of nuances and differences that we will get to, but first we're going to start with the drop biscuit. It's 2 cups of flour, a tablespoon of white sugar, and a tablespoon of baking powder, then a half a teaspoon of salt. just going to go ahead and use my pastry blender to essentially whisk those dry ingredients together. I'm going to use this when I cut in the butter, and then I'll switch over to the spinella to get the dough formed when we add in the milk. When making biscuits, we want that little bit of flakiness, whether we're doing cut or drop biscuits. So we want to make sure that we're using really cold, fresh out of the fridge. Some people would say from the freezer. Either way, you want cold butter that we're going to make into a crummy combination here with the dry ingredients using our pastry blender. Then we will stir in the milk. So I'm going to be right back. I'm going to grab the butter and the milk from the fridge and get them right in with these dry ingredients. I'm going to cut this down. We need 4 tablespoons. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm going to cut it down into smaller little pads, and that'll make it a little easier and faster to incorporate in with the dry ingredients. And again, I'm using the pastry blender. These are like, I'm cutting them about 2 millimeters thick or so. Probably end up with about 8 little pads, maybe 9 or 10. All right, again, cold, 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 quick in there. And then I'm just gonna use my pastry blender and just press and break those little pads of butter into the flour combo, and it'll start to look a little crummy. Then I'll kind of scrape off this pastry blender and I'll pour in the milk. I kind of like to do this sort of press and then, I don't know, what do we call this motion? Press and toss, because I am pushing pretty hard against the bottom. And then if any butter sticks to the pastry blender, you can see lots of sticking. You want to go ahead and slide that off. We don't want too big of flakes. We want smaller flakes so that we get that flakiness in our drop biscuit. This isn't quite as crummy as like a pie crust would be. I kind of do the same concept with the cold butter with the pie crust, but there's just more dry ingredient here, so that's not going to look quite as crummy, but that looks nicely incorporated. I don't see any large pieces of butter in here anymore. And we're going to then switch over to our spinella, and we're going to stir in the milk and get that dough to form. That will be our drop biscuits. We have our drop biscuit dough ball ready to go. And the main difference, before I start dropping these on, I want to share the difference between the 2 types of biscuit recipes. The main difference is that the drop biscuits have more milk in them, so it's a little bit wetter of a dough, so I can just scoop and drop. The cut biscuits are a little bit thicker, if you will, and they have less buttermilk. In this case, we're doing, you could use regular milk as well, but I want to make a buttermilk biscuit. That tanginess, and I want that flavor in there. And also we're going to be adding baking soda and baking powder to the cut biscuit to give it that good rise, that when you think of like a flaky built biscuit that's going to rise. So the buttermilk, the cold butter, and the baking powder, baking soda combination is going to make that happen. But for the drop biscuits, again, a little bit more milk. I'm just going to use a spoon. We're just dropping, just like that. So they have more of an ovalish shape, I feel like drop biscuits do. The cut biscuits are obviously going to be circular. Should be able to get about 12 out of this batch. I can see the little pads of butter that we cut into the dough right there. Oop, that one's a little too big. I find like a spoon is easier. You can kind of get the uniform size. If you need to kind of shape them, you can. So fabulous. And then of course we have our maple cardamom or maple cinnamon. You could do the exact same thing with honey, same ratio, 2 tablespoons to a full stick or tablespoon to a half stick. These are not going to spread like cookies do, so these are a little close to the edge. That's okay. Make sure there's one little bit here. And these are ready for the oven. So we're going to bake these drop biscuits at 400 degrees for 10 to 12 minutes. They're super quick. Again, I'm going to set my oven at 10 minutes and then watch them, see if they need that extra 2 minutes to golden on top and bake through. Now for the cut biscuits. Let's get the dough ready to go. I have a pastry mat here. I'm going to use that to form the disc of the dough once we get it put together. But first we're going to start, just like we did with the drop biscuits, with the dry ingredients. So we have 2 cups of flour, a tablespoon of sugar, a tablespoon of baking powder, half a teaspoon of baking soda, and half a teaspoon of salt. And I am going to just combine those lightly together. And then I'm going to get the butter from the freezer and the buttermilk from the fridge. Again, we want cold butter and cold buttermilk to get that max flakiness into our dough. And I have a cheese grater here. If you really want perfect butter for your biscuit dough, grating the stick of butter, which is why it's in the freezer. It's easier to grate a frozen stick of butter. If it's not frozen, it'll still work. It'll just be, you might have to scrape off the bottom a little bit more. This is going to get that max crumminess. We can use the pastry blender, or if the bits and shavings are small enough, you can just mix it in with your spatula. I do need to cut off 2 tablespoons of this. This one wasn't in the freezer as long, but it'll come just like cheese. If it's frozen, it'll be a little bit more shaved, if you will. And I need to do this quickly because the heat from my hand will melt the top. It's easier to do the full stick like this. You could try to use the paper to kind of create a barrier, but your hand is still going to be warm through there. And then this last bit, I might end up cutting in with the pastry blender because I don't want to get too close. Look at this pile of magic. Now I got to incorporate all of this gorgeous shaved butter in with the flour. And it just literally disappears into the flour. Like you can see that it's crummy, but you can't even see that it's like that mountain of butter was just in here. Now for the buttermilk. And again, this is a little more butter, a little less milk. So this dough is going to be, I'm going to end up forming it over here on the pastry mat, which is why I got it out. I mean, I can like see the flakes before they even bake with the way that that butter was shaved like that. Cannot wait. This looks a little more like a pie crust dough does, but that's okay. I'm going to transfer this over to the pastry mat and then I'll be able to form it into a disc. I have a little bowl of flour for dusting, and I'm going to actually start in the bowl and just lightly press and try and get the dough to form. So I'm really just kind of pressing it into the bottom of the bowl. This side is a little more flour, this side's a little more wet, so I'll probably kind of try and turn it lightly. I don't want to overwork this. I'm going to transfer it out here now. But we want to form this dough into a flat disc. Then we want to go about a ½ inch tall. We don't want to use a rolling pin. Don't bust out your rolling pin. This is not a pie crust. There's enough little flaky bits that I'm going to add like ½ a teaspoon more of buttermilk, like just a touch, just to incorporate that. Also bring that cold factor back in, just right on top. And then we're going to try and pick up, use that there, it's perfect, just a touch. Pick up some of those drier ingredients and then continue to fold and shape it. I think this middle section needs a smidge more. It's a very fine balance, okay? A dusting. And we're just going to gently fold and knead, and now I think I'm going to try and shape. Seems to be a good consistency throughout each of these layers, and I'm just going to press it out. I might even kind of press to the side. I want about ½ an inch, which looks to be about right there. And then we're going to do a cut. Lightly floured, perfection right there. And then we can kind of reshape, again without overworking, and try and get another cut over here. The top of my biscuit cutter sadly left us today. I'm just going to use my frosting spreader. It's just a good thin metal And we're just gonna keep going around, lightly pressing out, kind of shaping the edges after we've cut them, all the way around. We want it to be fairly even so that they bake evenly, of course. And then once we've got all these cut, I will transfer to a baking sheet lined with parchment or a baking mat. And then we will bake to flaky perfection. And we want to do this fairly quickly because we want this dough to stay as cold as possible. It will warm up as we work with it. You can almost see, you can see the flaky before it even bakes. Oh. Okay, let me just very quickly, and again without overworking, recombine these characters. I'm gonna add just a touch. Another thing that you can do, I meant to do this and I got so enamored by the flakiness. You can dip your, once I've used this for dusting, you just dip in here and it just makes it a little easier to peel back. All right, we've got everything cut. This is essentially the same baking time as the drop biscuits. So we're going to transfer these onto our baking mat lined baking sheet. We do have baking mats in our store. You need to check those out. They're a little bit different than we have here. I have all the ones available at the office, but I wanted to make sure to highlight those here. So this is perfect. These 12 biscuits, these, especially these taller ones, are just gonna get that touch of golden on top. They're gonna be amazing. So we're gonna bake these at 400 for 10 minutes. If we need to add an additional 1 to 2 minutes, go ahead and do that until you get that nice golden perfection. And then we're gonna side by side compare the drop and the cut biscuits, and of course try one with some of our maple compound butter. I think this episode has inadvertently turned into a battle of the biscuits. We've done battles around here before. Okay, drop biscuit, cut biscuit. I mean, first of all, excuse me, that's the butter. Crisping and crusting up perfectly. The real winner is this butter compound and these gorgeous flaky buttery / buttermilk biscuits. I mean, really, everybody's a winner today. So this has been in the fridge. I can see the specks of the cardamom. It's gonna have just a touch of sweetness with the maple that we mixed in. Of course, you could do like a honey cinnamon would work really well, or maple cinnamon, but it's just magical. I kind of don't want to burn my tongue, but I feel like we have to try. Maybe I'll make a little, oh, it's like melting everywhere. This is like, my kids say like drippy and like Riz. Riz biscuits right here. If you don't know what I'm talking about, ask your kids. They'll know. Gotta make these. Oh, we gotta try this with the cut biscuits too. With the flaky biscuits though, I like to like break them in their flake. Look at that steaminess, but we're gonna go heavy. We go heavy at the gym and we go heavy on our butter and biscuits. And I'm just gonna let this have a minute. Okay, also golden. This one's a little flakier. You know, the cut biscuits, it takes a little practice of getting the right balance of the butter, the buttermilk, and the flour to get them to that right consistency. Look at how gorgeous this is. I mean, it's just like melting everywhere. It's melting into the other layers. Like, if you learned anything from me today, let it be how to make a butter compound. Give this maple cardamom or honey cinnamon, same ratio, a try. It's just so good. And I'm basically gonna be eating toast with this, or the rest of these, my kids will be home from school soon. It's gonna get polished. It's gonna be out of here. But this butter, it's for me. I'm gonna hide it in the fridge and make sure that it's only for me. I can enjoy with my toast or with the biscuit. So that's cut biscuits, drop biscuits, the difference in the dough, tiny little nuances, easier to do the drop, less, you know, cutting. It's easy to do, takes a few extra minutes, gives you that different type of flakiness, a little rise to the biscuit. Of course, our butter compound, get that made. I hope you learned something new. If you did, please watch some of our other videos here in this series. We have wonderful ideas and cooking hacks and cooking lessons in the Learn to Cook on a Budget series here on the channel. We have all sorts of different themes and cooking methods and cooking strategies available, so get to watching and binging as your schedule allows. Please like this video if you did learn something new, and also subscribe to the channel so you'll get notified when we release new episodes at noon Central Time on Wednesdays.